I sure hope all is going well with you. Hope that things are going well with you and that you are doing well today. And I want to talk a little bit about Queen Amanirenas today. So I hope that you are doing well as we kind of get started and get kicked off here. I want to talk a little bit about Queen Amanirenas today. And the whole idea that failure is not an option, even that failure is not what we think. And there's really no such thing as failure in a lot of the ways we look at failure. And I think that being able to look back at our ancestors and look at the example that so many people left us in Africa and in various places, there's so many marvelous things we can learn. And her example, if in my opinion, is an outstanding example. We're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about Queen Amanirenas of Kush. We're going to jump out and talk about. First, I want to say thank you to all of those who've been supporting me. Thank you so much for asking questions and ask how you can support. And I want to also mention for those who have been talking about it and just, kind of joining up on YouTube and becoming a member. I want to make this announcement and let you know that I'm starting a bit of a library, if you will. I'm rolling out a bit of a library and books and mini textbooks, if you will, to people who are members here on YouTube. So I thank you very much for your support. For those who are members, I'm rolling out books that you can download, mini books. It's going to be on like a mini library, and it's accessible on the site that's in our member tab. If you look under the community posts, you can see our member tab and you can see the site as well as the password for the latest information, and that password will be updated and changed every so often. But not only am I releasing books in terms of like a library, also courses. So I'm also releasing courses that you can dig deeper into this information. So I'll be going through things like ancient Kush, ancient Kemet, a lot of personalities, topics, if you will. And the very first course that I released is with respect to what happened before Kemet. Like, how did Kemet become Kemet? How did Kemet get started? Taking a look at Napatan, as well as the whole Nakada culture and the whole A group Nubians and the Kustu incense burner. And there's a whole mini textbook that goes along with that course. And it's right here on this page for people who are members, and you can access it. And as I mentioned, this is only $4.99 a month for those who are here on YouTube. I very much appreciate your support. And I want to build a library to support your knowledge and support our knowledge, as well as a course. As courses that'll do it. So the first course is called Before Egypt, Before Kemet, and it looks at, as I mentioned, the A group Nubians, the whole Nakatan culture and the southern culture of what will become ancient Kemet, as well as just Napatan and various things with respect to that, and how the development of the culture that became Kemet really came out of the southern part of what will become that country. It wasn't a situation where it came from the north down to the south, but some group from outside of Africa came into this place, and suddenly, all of a sudden, the Kemetic culture developed. That's not what happened. This happened over many thousands of years, and it was a native culture. It was a native group that developed into that. So I just wanted to kind of put that in there and let you know that this was something that I'm talking about, and something that gives you more resources around it, give you some more references, allow you to dig deeper into the information. And I've also included, in addition to a video that will go with the course, a mini textbook, as well as quizzes, so you can kind of check your knowledge. So I hope that you come away from the courses that I put out, as well as the many textbooks that I put out, with more information, and kind of be solidified in what you believe in, develop your own opinions, and share this with your children. Let's get this information out here. And it's a lot of work. So I put up course 1 thus far. So I have course 1, which is talking about what happened before Kemet. How did Kemet get started? But I'm going to be putting up more. So I'm going to be putting up things with respect to ancient Kush, with respect to Amanirenas, a whole lot of things I'm going to put up. It's going to take me a while to do that. It's a lot of work to go into it, but I very much appreciate it. And I thank those of you who are willing to support it, $4.99 a month, to help get access to that and just support this channel and what we're doing and what I'm doing here. So I very much appreciate. And I ask that you continue to support, and that you guys will join up if you find this worthwhile. So let me know if you have any more questions. But I want to jump into talking about Queen Amanirenas today. I want to talk about a woman I think who stands out in history. She stands out in history for so many reasons. And many of you watching this may probably know about her. You know that she was a queen in ancient Kush. And you know that she was a queen who fought many battles. That she was a queen who went to battle and led her army into battle, into war. She wasn't just a queen, somebody who just sat back on the sidelines. She was somebody who got involved and went into war, if you will. And as you think about that, there's a whole reason. You think about what battles you're fighting. Like, what battles are you really fighting in your life? And I think Queen Amanirenas helps us really think through that whole idea, and the idea of what it means to fight and what you're fighting for. That's what I get out of her life. So I want to kind of set the time frame in terms of when she lived, just so we can have some perspective. Because when you look at the whole kingdom of Kush, and you take a look at this whole timeline, if you will, of ancient Kush, you'll find that, ancient Kush lasts for a long period of time. It lasted for a long period of time. A lot of times, we limit, a lot of, Western scientists, a lot of people will try to limit ancient Kush's history. And we try to make it seem like it only existed during the time of the New Kingdom, or only existed during a period of time. And you can note just from right here, this period of time right here, from 1070 to about 900 was a bit of a renewal. From about 1500 to about 1070 or so, a little more than 400 years, that's when the New Kingdom ruled ancient Kush, ruled that area of Kush, what we call Kush. That's when the New Kingdom ruled Kush. And so it's not like it's this extended period of time. And they like to conflate, what's happening in certain parts of Lower Nubia or Northern Nubia, what was happening in southern parts of Nubia, and conflate all the different peoples who had different political entities and different organizations and societies that they developed. And they sometimes had coalitions. They sometimes were at odds themselves. And we just like to look at them as if they were all some lump sum. It's like taking North America and saying that United States and Canada are one, and Mexico, that's all one place, and not looking at the distinct political entities and societies that developed there. And that's kind of what we do with Kush. So we make it seem like they don't have very much of a history. That's just not true. And just to give you some perspective, when you look at ancient Kush, as you probably know, this whole area that is around the southern part of what is today what is today Egypt, right here, right under the first cataract, that is the area of Lower Nubia, if you will. And when you go back before the dynastic time, pre-dynastic time, you're talking 3800 BC, and even before that, you're talking people who were A group Nubians who were above this cataract, who were within the boundaries of what will become ancient Kemet. This is the southern boundary of ancient Kemet, right where the first cataract is. That's the traditional southern boundary. And that's kind of a natural boundary, if you will, in terms of geographically speaking, the geography. But before ancient Kemet becomes, like, in pre-dynastic time, you have Nubian people, A group Nubian people, so they're called by archaeologists. They are there in Kustul. They're there in modern day northern Sudan. They are up there in Kubania. They are up above the southern border of ancient Kemet. They're within the boundaries of ancient Kemet before Kemet becomes a dynasty. This whole idea that they're completely separate is just ridiculous. But as you think about it, I want to make note there are many different important historical sites in what will become Kush and what will become the area that will be ruled as Kush. And at times, Kush would have control of it. At times, they wouldn't. At times, you'd have people who were Medjay or the Erjet or the Wawet. You'd have different people there. But when you look back, you can go back some 200,000 years and see people and human activity right here in Sai Island, right there in what is today northern Sudan. You can go back hundreds of thousands of years and see human ancestral activity in Sai Island. And this whole, so it's not like this is, something that just happened 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. We like to look at African history and history with respect to Kush and Kemet as if it only took place within the past 2,000 or 3,000 years or 4,000 years, and that's it, right? And that's just not the case. That's just not how human activity went. That's not how human beings developed and did various things. Things were happening for thousands of years and hundreds of thousands of years in this area. And Sai Island is one of them. You can look it up and take a look at it. Another area that became a center of area that archaeologists look at with respect to urbanization, especially when the time that the Sahara Desert started to dry out very suddenly, 4000 BC starting to dry out, you can start to see urbanization take place around the Nile and in this particular place in Kerma. So you probably have heard of Kerma before. If you're not, we'll tell you today, right? Kerma, this whole area that is Kerma was an area that developed into an urban area. It developed into an urban area just like you had urban areas developing all up and down the Nile Valley as the Sahara started to dry out more and more 4,000 years ago. You find them there. And the earliest activity, you find a lot of activity from an urban perspective from the latest period, if you will, that we've looked at and kind of dug up. And from an archaeological standpoint, that's happening right around 3,500 BC. So when you think about 3,500 BC, when you start to think about A group Nubian people being there 3,800 BC and what would become ancient Kemet being there and a part of that, when you think of the Kustul instance burner being there around 3,200, 3,100 BC on the border between Sudan and Egypt today's Sudan and Egypt, you see that in Kerma as well. You see that, urbanization is taking place, and they call it pre-Kerma. That's the period that archaeologists give it. But pre-Kerma urbanization and activity is taking place 3,000, 2,500 years BC. That's the same time as pre-dynastic Kemet. That's the same time as dynastic Kemet. You have activity going on and what will become Kush. And just to give you an idea, when people sometimes talk about Kush, a lot of times they're talking about this area right here, this southern part of Nubia, this area where you have the second cataract, the third cataract, Kerma, the major city of Napatan, and later on the major city of Meroitic. And as this civilization developed. I mean, you have precursors, as I mentioned, going back hundreds of thousands of years. You have ebbs and flows of human activity. You have the drying out of the Sahara relatively recently from a geological standpoint, several thousand years ago, 4000 BC, and people grabbing around and urbanization beginning to take place. And you see that certain areas, geographical areas, being developed to become important. So Kerma becomes important. The idea of Napatan right there around the fourth cataract becomes important. And then later on, many years later, it was kind of before then, but you begin to see Meroitic become important as well as you get below the fifth cataract, between the fifth and the sixth cataract of the Nile, rocky area of the Nile. And so when you see that develop over a period of time, this kingdom of Kush has many rulers. And in particular, you start to see it, particular during the time when Meroe is a strong center of power in the kingdom of Kush, you begin to see women even more prominently. You begin to see female rulers in their own rights. Kandakes, rulers who were outright rulers, who took on the title of rulers, not just, a ceremonial type of title, if you will, but really rulers outright, as well as queen mothers, right? And held a significant role. So as we start to jump into that, I think, God bless you. Your name is Amanirenas. Very good. A name is related to Africa or God Aman. Well, good. That's very good question. Is Amanirenas, does that name relate to the God Amen? So, we'll talk about that. So that's a very good question, Ayo. That's a very good question. Thank you for asking that question, because in fact it does. So apparently the name Amanirenas relates to the deity Amen, right? It does relate to Amen, and Amani itself stands for Amen. So apparently the name Amani in the Kushite language, if you will, in particular around the Meroitic time, that name Amani was referring to the god Amen. So if you have a name named Amani, you might be related some kind of way in terms of your name historically to what was happening in ancient Kush. But apparently the term Amani refers to Amen. So you see a lot of people, you'll see Amanirenas, you're going to see Amani Shanteko, you're going to see Amani Torre, you're going to see that name Amani pop up quite a bit in ancient Kemet and in ancient Kush with respect to just that name, and it's referring to the god Amen. So you know that the Kushite people began to do even more with that whole concept of Amen after the period of time with the new kingdom. And so we'll touch on that. So thank you for asking that. And you can look it up. I've seen people talk about it and archaeologists talk about it. So apparently Amani with respect to ancient Meroitic language and ancient Kushite language relates to the god Amen and is a reference to the god Amen. It's like their language for Amen. So when you look at that, as I start to look at, we mentioned that, 3000 BC, 3500 BC, people are in this area, the third cataract, and urbanization is taking place. You see what they call the pre-Kerma period in archaeology. That is, you see that developing, and you start to see, a number of different things. You start to see other periods within respect to ancient Kerman and ancient Kushite history begin to develop. And at one point in time, Kemetic people called them Yam. They're in the southern part. I'm referring to the southern part of ancient Kemet, referring to that southern part of Nubia. A lot of times, at one point in time, the Kemetic people called it Yam. And it isn't until the Middle Kingdom that you hear the word Kush being used with respect to this whole area that's around the third cataract, south of the second cataract of the Nile. They're in modern day Sudan. So you start to hear the word Kush used, but we know people are there. People are gathering around, and you start to see just an explosion. I mean, there's already trade up and down the Nile. So just to kind of build this out, there's already trade up and down the Nile for thousands of years, guys. We just like to think of 3,500 years ago as being old. It really isn't old in human history. It represents less than 1% of human history. If you understand and know that human beings have been around for 200, 300,000 years, 3,000 years ago is nothing. It's a drop in a bucket, if you will. It's not, and 1,000 years ago is nothing. So it really isn't that long in human history ago. And people are up and down for many thousands of years, all up and down this watery highway that is the Nile. And trade is going on. Kerman resources and pottery and gold and jewelry and all types of things are taking place and are traveling up and down the Nile. So you can find things and resources like ostrich eggs and ivory and wood that comes from central part of Africa in the Mediterranean. How does it get there? It doesn't grow there. You know what I'm saying? It didn't grow there. You literally find stones and resources that are found in the central part of Africa in the Mediterranean. And you will find things in the Mediterranean in the central part of Africa and in Kerma. And it's clear that there's trade going up and down the Nile for thousands of years, many thousands of years before we give it credit. And this whole idea, Kush is there. Kush is a powerhouse. The people are there. They are powerhouse. They have different geography. So they have different challenges. You know, the rocky areas of the Nile, they have different challenges. And in some ways, they might have been sparsely populated than other areas. But they're up and down there this whole time. They are a power force. They are controlling gold mines. They are controlling trade up and down this area. And a lot of people are after them. A lot of people want to control that area, in particular Kemet. A lot of times you see, especially in the Middle Kingdom, for Kemet, people are coming down into Kush in the southern part to control that area. And they talk about trade. They talk about people getting out of their boats and not passing their fort and having certain things happen to them if they're not going through Kemetic trade forts, if you will, and doing their own types of things. That's talked about in the Middle Kingdom. So you see that because they have resources, because they have a lot of trade that's going on, and because they have precious things, and probably also because God's land and the land of Punt at some point in time was accessed through going south. Obviously, they could go out west and go down, or they could go south directly from where they were, and they did that many times, going south where God's land was. So this whole area of Middle Kerma, which is, instead of just thinking Middle Kingdom, think Kush. And think Kerma. So this whole Middle Kerma period is around 2050 BC to about 1750 BC. And then you have a classic Kerma period where there's an explosion of art and pottery and urbanization and temple building and trade up and down. And you see that through the graves and the tombs, as well as the leftovers in terms of artifacts with respect to archaeology. That's taking place in Kerma right here in the southern part of Nubia, right here around this ancient city of Kerma, and between that third and fourth cataract of the Nile. That's taking place. That's continuing to take place along this period of time. So Kush has a history, right? And a long history and a rich history. And there are many people up and down this area. It's not like it's just one type of person and one people. Just like ancient Kemet had people fighting for land and vying for resources. People were vying for resources here. The gold and the ostrich feathers and ostrich eggs and ebony and diorite and all those types of precious resources. They were vying for it there as well, and the control of that. And you end up finding that for a period of time from about 1500 or 1550 really to about 1070. So a period of about, 400 or 500 years, not more than that, you find that the New Kingdom starts, or a little less than 500 years, you find that the New Kingdom takes over part of Kush, and they take over this whole proper under Thutmose I and Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. They're controlling this area, pretty much the New Kingdom. And obviously, Kush is fighting. So we'll talk about that because we'll get into the battles that Kush fought with the New Kingdom. And you know that it wasn't like it was one and done. It's not like Thutmose I came in, people from the New Kingdom and Kemet came in and they just took over Kush and they killed him and they got rid of him. That's not what happened. If you look at the history and you read it, you will find that time and time again, the Kemetic people are saying, and we have to go back to Kush and fight. Now they're saying we kicked their butt and we have to go back to Kush and fight. And then the next king will come and a ruler will come and we have to go back to Kush and fight. Why do they keep going back to Kush and fight? If they were pushovers, right? Why do they keep having to go back every so often and destroy and to kill? Well, I mean, you aren't killing everybody because you keep coming back, right? And you're fighting other people. You do that because people are rising up. I mean, Kemetic people rose up against people who would try to overtake them. They did that, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And the Kushite people did the same thing. When you tried to take over them, they fought back. They were warriors, right? They were fighters, right? And so we like to look at them in a different way, but they were not pushovers. And the Kemetic people did not just run rampant over them without a fight, and the Kemetic people did not run rampant over the Kushite people and just take over their deities and disrespect their deities. That didn't happen. In many cases, you will find Kemetic people not destroying all the temples of the Kushite people and keeping them in place and having a Kemetic temple right beside a Kushite temple, respecting that local deity. And you also find, as we've already talked about, many things they shared in common, some veneration of the cattle and many things that they shared in common with respect to the whole culture that was taking place up and down the Nile and the trade that was taking place long before Kemet became a country. So there's already commonality there, but you see obviously societal differences and traditions develop, right? So once the New Kingdom is there and they're taking over part of them, the Kushite people are fighting and they're not just being pushed over, but the religion, the Kushite people don't hate. People like to make it seem as if there was just some evangelism that went on, and the priest in the New Kingdom at the end of the New Kingdom came into Kush and made them be converted unto this Amanism and served Amen. And that's I don't know that necessarily took place. You find the Kushite people being the people of their own right, believing as they chose to believe, taking things that they already had, in place in their society for many thousands of years, and meshing them with other people in other societies, even though they had common shared heritage, shared things they had in common, they had societal differences. And you find that the Kushite people accepted a lot of things and just merged, like a lot of people do and a lot of African people do, really merge a lot of things in together. So at a period of time where the New Kingdom was in charge, this period of time, it is a brief period of time. It's not like you have 1,000 years and the New Kingdom is in control. You're talking several hundred years. They are in control, but that control ends. And when that control ends, the Kushite people reorganize. As I mentioned, they had been fighting the whole time. They were not pushovers, and they accepted. They meshed their own deities and their own concept that were already akin to what was happening. They meshed them with the Kemetic things, and you find them taking on a worshiping and a perspective of our men that's different. That has a little bit of flavor to it. Has a little bit of a different flavor to it. They begin to be more committed in some ways than Kemet, because when the New Kingdom fell, there was a vacuum. A power vacuum. And the people in ancient Kush were practicing the ways of the old ways of the religion more so than some people in northern Kemet. And so you find the priests and the rulers in the southern part of Kemet reaching out to and accepting the rulership of people that were in ancient Kush. So you start to see people like, and I've kind of showed this before, you start to see people like Alashta, and you start to see King Pianki and various people like that who are coming up, and they are ruling. They are basically in control, and they come in control of Upper Kemet, in the southern part of Kemet. You find that taking place. And it's not a situation where they are mad at him. It's a situation where the Kemetic people are accepting King Pianki, as we talked about in 743 BC. They're accepting King Kashta. They're accepting King Shabaka. They're accepting King Taharka. I mean, you find the northern part they had to take over, but the southern part welcomed the Kushite people with open arms. And I say that because the Kushite culture becomes very significant. And I think it's significant to the story of Amanirenas, because she's not, in my opinion, just fighting against the Roman army, which we'll talk about. She's fighting for her culture. And I think to myself, what if she didn't fight? What if she didn't stand up to the Roman army? What if the manner in which what if she was fighting for something different than what we think? Because a lot of times we think about things in battles in terms of different things. And it's not about what you take, right? It's about what you become, right? It's not about the material things you have. It's about what you become. That's what your life is about. And that's what your battle is about. And I think her life shows us that. So as we begin to set it up, we see that, during this period of time between 1070 and 900, a renewal is taking place in Kush. It had already been around, as I mentioned, for many, many thousands of years. For 3500 BC, it had been around for many thousands of years. But after the New Kingdom, a renewal takes place around 1070 to 900 BC. And you begin to see around 900 BC, the Napatan period began. And that area that is Napata, right here around the fourth cataract of the Nile, becomes a center of importance and a center of power, if you will, in ancient Kush. And you start to see King Pianki and Taharka. They develop into a strong dynasty, and they're the dynasty in their own right. So they are a dynasty before they take over all of Kemet. They are a dynasty. They unite the southern part of Sudan, this southern part of Nubia. They unite this whole area. And they bring them into one after the Kemetic rule. Kashta and Alara bring them into one. Kashta's father bring them into one. They unite them, and then they go up and they take over southern Kemet. They take over Lower Nubia. They take over this area as well. So this is a vast area in and of itself that they're ruling. This whole area right here, from like the first cataract down to Meroitic. This is a vast area, and then they go in and they take over the southern part of Kemet. And Waset, which we call today Thebes, they take over that as well. And so that becomes a period of time where they're strong. And this is a dynasty. This is a kingdom that would last for well over 1,000 years. After Kemet, they're lasting for well over. You can go into the period of AD. Literally, you can go into after the birth of Christ, and you can find them still worshiping, still honoring our men, still practicing their ways. Well over 1,000 years later, and you begin to say, how do you do that? How do you have a country and a culture that lasts for over 1,000 years? How do you do that? And the Kemetic people did it. Obviously, there are a lot of people who have done it, and there are a lot of people who haven't. A whole lot of people who haven't. The Kushite people however, are some people who haven't, who have done that, right? And so when you look at this whole Napatan period, or with respect to 900 BC, you start to see that strength of the Napatan period, and you see a period of time where they begin to shift their focus to Meroitic. And people talk about, some of the fighting that took place and why they shifted, and sometimes the battle that they mentioned that happened before them shifting their kingdom and their capital to Meroitic a little farther south. It happened like 200 or 300 years before they did that. So before the capital switched. So, I mean, people say things, but sometimes you got to think about, did they really, run because of a battle if they moved their capital 300 years later? Like, people say things like that, but we'll get into more of that. But so it's this whole Meroitic period, as we start to look at and see, this is the period within which Amanirenas lived. So she lived and she reigned in this period, in this Meroitic period. And if you had to put her in a time frame to kind of figure out when did she live, think about the time when the Romans took over, because she is famous for fighting the Roman army. But to me, she's famous for more than that. She's famous for keeping her culture alive. She's famous for allowing this whole line of Kushite dominance, of Kushite worship, of Kushite, tradition and culture, keeping it alive and not letting it be swallowed up by the Roman army when a lot of things were being swallowed up. So you got to think, when the Roman army came into ancient Kemet around 30 BC, they're taking over a lot of stuff. When you look at it, we talked about the Assyrians, 600 BC, 600 and 700 BC, and they were killing a lot of people and doing a lot of ruthless things in what we call today's Middle East. Well, by the time the Romans came around 30 BC and thereabouts, they're killing a lot of people. I mean, when you think about crucifixions, that's a crucifixion. I mean, they did crucifixions. You think about the gladiators and things, we kind of glorified it, but that was brutal. Watching people just kill them, rip themselves apart, or putting people in, there are all kinds of Christian adaptations to people who were martyrs, who were literally put in coliseums or put in areas where they would just let a lion out. And there was the famous one of a woman who was an early martyr in Christianity. I remember reading the story. It was a powerful story. They wanted her to recant her belief in Jesus, her belief in God, and she wouldn't. And they basically said, they're trying to give her a break because it was a woman. They're, basically, we're going to kill you if you don't recant this. You got to pray to the emperor, and you got to, and she said, I'm not going to pray to the emperor. Well, you're going to die. So they literally would starve these animals and would let them out in an arena, in an area where the victim could not leave, and they would let them rip them apart. And people would stand around and watch and cheer. I mean, literally, guys, they would stand and watch. So imagine somebody literally being eaten by a lion and ripped apart, and screaming, obviously, crying, blood everywhere, being ripped apart, and people just looking at it and laughing and cheering it on, and nobody stopping it. I mean, so when we talk about the Roman army, we talk about Romans, we don't talk about that side of them. They're brutal. I mean, they're not taking over this part of the world and not being brutal. I mean, I look at the Assyrian army as being exceptionally brutal and doing things with warfare, and the Greek army did the same thing. Macedonia in particular, not necessarily Athens, Macedonia in particular, but the Roman army did the same thing. They approached warfare differently. They approached professional soldiers differently. They approached organization and numbers and weaponry and what you did to people differently. And as long as you paid your tribute to them, as long as you did, a lot of times they let you keep your own religion, but you had to worship you had to also pay your taxes and give deference to the emperor. And for people who didn't want to do it, they had problems. And if you didn't want to pay your taxes, you had problems, right? So a lot of people in this time around 30 BC, and that's the time the Roman army kind of comes into ancient Kemet and takes over the Ptolemies and takes over the Greek part of ancient Kemet, because the Greeks had been there for 200 or 300 years. This is at the tail end of Kemet's history. This is, not 3,000 years BC. This is at the tail end of her history. The Greeks are there, and the Romans come in, and they kill a lot of people, and they take over. And there's a very interesting piece of history that talks about that. When they're taking over, the Roman army is not, planting daisies and giving out flowers. They're killing people, and they're ruthless, and they mean it. And so it's an army. It's a 2,000-year-old army. It's an army that's doing this. And it's kind of interesting because I think people don't really get a perspective that ancient Kemet was occupied and taken over by Greece for 300 years before the Romans came. So a lot of times we mix up, just to give you an idea, we mix up this whole timeline of Greek and Roman rule with ancient Kemet as if sometimes it was the natural first rule, and it wasn't. The people who were in ancient Kemet, the area that would become Kemet, pre-dynastic, 3100, 3500, 3800 BC, they were not Greek and Roman. The Greeks and Romans at the time were not powerful. So we just mix it up. So a lot of times, it's important for you to know your history, because they will show you Greek and Roman temples and restorations of temples and Greek and Roman artifacts and images of Greek and Romans in temples in Kemet, but not tell you that they were built, during the Greek and Roman time. They just make it seem like, then it's, well, this was actually built in 300 BC, or this was actually built in 30 BC. It was not built in 3000 BC. It was built like 3,000 years later. And people would just make it seem like that particular temple was a part of the ancient Kemetic way of life. And it wasn't. It was really just the Roman attempt to kind of placate the people who were there and get them under control. And pretty soon they stopped keeping up the temples, and they said, forget that, we're going to keep moving on. We're not spending all this money. That's the Romans did. So they kind of moved on. So at this time, around 30 BC, the people in ancient Kush were powerful. The people in ancient Kush were still there. They were powerful and they were proud, right? And you have the Roman army, as I mentioned, taking over, and they're there in ancient Kush, and they are in Kemet, and they're going to meet. They're going to come into contact with Kushite people. They're going to come in contact with Queen Amanirenas. They're going to come in contact with people from Nubia, as you might imagine, because they're right there on that border between the first cataract and above that being Kemet and below that being Nubia. And all this area, at the time when the Roman army came into this area, all this area was controlled by Kush. So this area that was up here, this is all Kush. And, and by the time 30 BC comes around, this is Queen Amanirenas' queendom. This is her area. This is her land. She's ruling this. And she's not a fake ruler. She's not just a ceremonial ruler. She is a ruler 30 BC and right after the time, 28 BC, 27 BC. She's the ruler of this whole area. And Kush has taken over. Meroe is its capital at this time, around 30 BC. Meroe is its capital. Napatan is a part of it. Kerma is a part of it. This is a large area. All what was encompassed the ancient area of Sinai and the ancient area of Kustal. And it's all this Nubian desert, this northern Nubian desert is under Kushite control. And as you might imagine, the Roman army is going to come into contact with Nubians right around this area. They're going to butt heads because there are temples in here. There are gold routes, there are trade routes, and there are holy places that the Kushite people insisted that they be able to worship at. So you're going to find things bump. The heads are going to bump. That was naturally going to happen. And here's where Amanirenas' story comes in. Here's where she begins to step up. And so this is around 30 BC. God bless you, where temples are built down Tarka period. Yeah, okay. Some of the Tarka, thank you so much. And so you have, when you look at it, you start to see that there's going to be some heads butting. And so Amanirenas comes in this time period, and there is an interesting piece of history that you can read about. And I'll share that with you as you look in this. So, we're talking about from 50 BC for some of these people, and 30 BC going into 100 AD, a whole series of female rulers, not fake rulers. And I know we talking about Kamala Harris and a lot of different things, but this is important. Some places in the world have not come until today, literally to this day and age, where they've had females in rulership positions. There are some places in religious segments that still don't have women rule. When you look back at ancient Africa, in particular in Northeast Africa, in particular in Kush, you will find women playing roles that they have never played in many other places in the world. And I love to hear about it. I'd love to hear about many female rulers, especially going back thousands of years ago. Let's share and talk, because I know there are some, right? But from what I've seen and read, the women in ancient Kush kind of stand out in a place on their own, and they speak to a lot of things that are even happening in this time. Some things I think that only mother can tell you. So as I think about this, as you look at this, you start to break down this whole history that we talked about, and then we're going through a long period of history, and we get to a part where the Napatan part is in control, and then you have the Meroitic period, and this is when you have Queen Kendaki, who's a Kendaki Amanirenas, come to take place. There is a historical record of this, so I want to share this with you just so you know. The geographies of Strabo. So if you've read Strabo, you may be familiar with him. This is volume 3, right? And you will find him. This is one of the translations I'm going to read with you, and we're going to talk about. This is one of the major primary sources that talks about Queen Amanirenas. And I want to talk to you about what he says about her and what he says about the characteristics of the Kemetic people themselves and the Kushite people. It's interesting. I think it's interesting as we jump into it. And God bless you. And put any comments or thoughts you have down in the comments. I very much appreciate that. So as we come to he's talking, so this is Strabo, and you can read it, Google it yourself. This is volume 3, looking at that. And you can take a look at it, and it gives you the book here and the chapter. So he says, at present, the whole country, and he's talking about this whole area of Kemet, in particular, the southern part, but the whole area of Kemet he's talking about. At present, the whole country is in the same Pacific state. So he's talking about them being rather pacifists. Imagine this, guys, being at peace. I'm telling you, this whole concept, the Roman army was not like coming to share peace. He's talking about people who were at peace, who weren't fighting, who didn't want to kill. That's what he's talking about. It's literally what he's describing, that this whole country was in the same Pacific state, if you will. And the proof is that the upper country is sufficiently guarded by three cohorts, and these not three cohorts, and these not complete. He's saying essentially that, they're guarding the country with not a whole lot of troops. Like, they don't really have to have a whole lot of troops to guard this country, because this area is not really armed for war. They're not really thinking about killing people. They were living in peace. I mean, that's something to think about. If they were, a lot of times we make it seem like the Kemetic people and the Kushite people were always, fighting each other. Those are some of the records that have survived. The hundreds of years that span time where they're not fighting, where they're just trading and they're at peace. We just don't talk about. We just skip from one. So remember when people talk to you, pick out the timeline. That's why I like to show you a timeline. Look at the timeline of what they're talking about, because sometimes they're talking about events that were 300 years apart. I mean, who lives for 300 years? 300 years ago when they were fighting, nobody even remembers that. Nobody's alive who remember that 300 years ago. But we talk about it like it happened like yesterday and today, like it was right next to each other. So a lot of times you're dealing with situations where Kemetic people and Kushite people were not fighting. They were worshiping the same gods. For a long period of time, they were trading with each other and shaking each other's hands. And here is Strabo talking about that the Roman army could control the whole area of Kemet with not a whole lot of troops, because the people were passive. They weren't trying to fight them. They weren't organized to kill people like the Assyrians were and the Greeks and the Romans in this period of time. They were killing people. And it says, wherever the Ethiopians have ventured to attack, then it has been seen at risk of danger to their own country. So, because they're risking, he's saying they're attacking when they do choose to attack. And the rest of the forces in Egypt are neither very numerous, nor did the Romans ever employ them once they collected them into an army, never employed them and collected into a collected army, if you will. For neither are the Egyptians themselves of a warlike disposition, nor the surrounding nations, although their numbers be very large. He's saying that the Ethiopian people and the people who were in Nubia, Lower Nubia, and the Kushite people and the Kemetic people were not warlike. Imagine that, guys. I want to put they weren't trying to kill people. They weren't trying to kill each other. A lot of times they fought. Maybe they fought sometimes and they didn't kill as many people as the Assyrians and the Romans were killing. And they let people live. The whole concept of ma'at, the whole concept of living the way you want to be lived, of treating people the way you want to be treated, fighting when you have to. It seemed that they were living it. They weren't, they smelted iron, guys. They had iron, and they were smelting iron. They had all kinds of weaponry, in particular in Kemet. They had all kinds of weaponry. They weren't using it to kill people. They weren't mass producing weapons or mass producing armor in a way, even thinking and ideating on, let's go kill people. Let's go take over the world. Let's go do whatever. And that's not the case here. The Romans are taking over people and are killing people. And they're saying basically, you have a lot of people in this area and they're not really organized for war. They're pretty much, they're not in a warlike disposition. And he talks about Gallus, the first governor of the country, if you will, appointed under Augustus Caesar. So we're talking about Caesar, right? Augustus Caesar, very famous, the first, this famous, ruler and emperor of Rome, right? Augustus Caesar. And he's saying that Gallus was the first governor of the area appointed by Augustus Caesar, and he attacked the city. He talks about attacking a part of northern Kemet, and he talks about people revolting in about 28 BC. And, and that, it took a small body of people to overcome them. And he talks about people, beginning to fight back and that they fought back in Thebes, in the area that where Waset was, and that, they didn't want to pay tribute. So here are people in ancient Kemet fighting against the Roman army, not wanting them to rule. But the Roman army is coming with all kinds of troops. They're coming with people, all kinds of armor, all kinds of weaponry. And one of the things you did as a Roman army, you promised the soldiers a lot of stuff. I mean, the soldiers were treated, they were a whole class in and of themselves. They were a whole collection in and of themselves in society, because when you went to war as a Roman soldier, you got a lot of stuff. And so they had people willing to fight and with the incentives to fight and armed to fight and basically trained and thought to try to fight for, professionally for a long period of time. And so they came And they could kill a lot of people. And so they're fighting the Kemetic people, and the Kemetic people are not organized for war at this time, 30 BC, 28 BC. They're not organized. They're not fighting back. And he talks about that there was a period of time where he mentions, interesting enough, that that Gallus was invading Arabia, and that even the Arabia area, which you might consider to be modern day, where the Arabian area is today, talking about, he could have also, that those people were also not organized for war, and that he possibly could have taken over the whole area if he wasn't ratted out by an informant, if you will. And he talks about, part of the army of Gallus's army was stationed in Egypt for a while, stationed outside of Egypt, and he pulled them outside of Egypt to fight people in Arabia to the east of them. And as he did that, the Ethiopian army under Amanirenas became emboldened. What Amanirenas decided to do, Amanirenas decided to attack. She wasn't just, fighting the Roman army at this particular time. She was fighting the Roman army as well as the local rulers in southern Kemet. So she felt as if there was a belief as if they were either mistreating them or not allowing them access from a religion, or not paying tribute the way they were disrespecting them in some type of way. So there was a disagreement between Queen Amanirenas and her whole kingdom. And remember, her whole kingdom is all up and down of Lower Nubia and Upper Nubia. She has a dispute with the local rulers because the Roman army, the Romans were newly in charge, and you still had to have local people as your support, or you're not going to have a country. You're not going to have an area to rule if people aren't, you can't kill everybody. You aren't going to have an area to rule. So you have local people who are in charge and kind of puppets, if you will, for Caesar and the Roman government. But Amanirenas is not happy with them. So she leads a raid. She attacks. She attacks the southern part of Kemet. And as she attacks, she does it at a time, he says, when part of the Roman army is dispersed. And she's smart. So she comes up with a sneak attack. And she comes in there, and Gallus, who had drawn off his troops, he says, this is Strabo talking, was engaged in war with the Arabs. And he talks about that she invaded Thebes. So this southern part of Kemet, she invaded it. And she went into the area that's Aswan, right around that first cataract. So if you look at the very southern part of ancient Kemet, if we kind of take a look at the very southern part of ancient Kemet, just to kind of give you an idea of it, that whole southern part right there, which is where the first cataract is, that is an area that was the most southerly part of its border, if you will, from a traditional standpoint from ancient Kemet. So when you had Aswan, which is right there, you had Yebel, which is like Elephantine, you had Philae, the island of Philae. These are three very important cities in this area in the southern part of Kemet, and Queen Amanirenas attacks them. She comes and she takes them over, and she does apparently a surprise attack. And she does a surprise attack in that she's able to go in and take over this whole area. She's able to go in and take prisoners. She goes in and she destroys them. And she basically destroys three major areas in Upper Kemet: Aswan, Elephantine, and Philae. And she did that. She took people. Now he uses the word that she enslaved. She took people. She took a sudden inroad. So she did a surprise attack. She took many people there, and she apparently destroyed their temples, and she took this famous statue of Caesar. So she apparently tore down statues of Caesar because obviously the Roman army had put up statues of Caesar. She didn't like it. So she tore them down as a message to the people who were in Upper Kemet and these new rulers that were taking you over. She tore down the statues, and the word is that she took the statues back to Kush, to southern parts of Upper Nubia, and put it under a temple, and put the head of one of the statues, which may be in a museum today, maybe in the British Museum, but you can look that up, where they found actually a head of Augustus Caesar in the Sudan. So she apparently took his head, one of the heads of the statue, and put it underneath the floor in the entranceway to the temple, so that every time they walked in the temple, they would step on his head. So that's what she did. And so when she did that, Petronius was mad. He was upset. So here you have this woman coming, and she's leading the army, guys. She's not backward. She is leading the army. And he describes her as being strong. And he describes her as being a strong woman, and that she has one eye, that she was maybe blind in one eye. You could only assume this is where the idea of her being blind in one eye came from. He talks about it here. Strabo talks about it. You would assume that she may have gotten that in battle. It doesn't say, he doesn't know, but you would assume that she would have gotten it some kind of way, right? So then Petronius, the response from the Roman army is to take, about 10,000 people and 800 horses armies and go up against, thousands of her people, right? And they're fighting. And so he talks about that he enters into the Ethiopian city, probably going into the northern part of Sudan today, and the northern part north of Kerma, we believe, and would have been attacking there. And so he's fighting and he's attacking, and Queen Amanirenas disperses. She disperses, her son disperses, and he continues to go farther south and to go into Napatan. And so you have the Roman army, now kind of marching and kind of going forward, and it is charging into Kush proper, because Queen Amanirenas and the Kushite army just went into Roman territory essentially and took over ransacked three areas, three major cities, took away captives, tore down their statues, brought them back, and brought resources back. So they're mad, they're ticked off, and they're going into now Kush, and they're fighting Queen Amanirenas, and then battles go back and forth. And of course, Strabo is telling the story in a way obviously that's beneficial to the Roman army, right? So he's going to say that, but as you read through it, you start to think that maybe something else is happening that he isn't quite communicating because of the facts that are shared. So he talks about, this Queen Candace, and by the way, the word Candace comes from that Kandake. So Kandake was an official term for the Queen Mother. The ancient Kushite people had Kandake, and that was just translated to Candace when you see it. And sometimes you might see it even mentioned like in places in the Bible or various places like that when they're saying Candace, and people's names might be Candace today, but that Candace that's referred to with respect to ancient Kush is referring to a title for a woman who was a queen mother and a ruler back in ancient Kemet. So it was a queen mother, and we just, took a title and made it a name, but that her name wasn't Candace, right? So just so that and kind of can get that perspective. So it talks about, he calls her Candace, and generals of Candace, the queen of Ethiopia, and he calls her, a strong woman. He says masculine here, and she's lost one eye. And so as Petronius begins to, and the Roman army begins to pursue her, and she disperses some of her troops, they pursue her down into perhaps Napata, going into the Sudan, the southern part of Nubia and Upper Nubia, and they're fighting, and they disperse and they fight. And then the Roman army decides to, we're going to set up a fort here, because the Kemetic people tried to do it later on, earlier. We're going to set up a fort, and we're going to arm it with soldiers, and we're going to keep these, Kushite people under control, because we can't have this coming back and forth into our area. So as soon as he sets them up, Amanirenas raises them again. She comes and she attacks the fort. So Queen Amanirenas, she begins to, the fortress that's there, she begins to take over the fort and to basically attack them in a way where the fort is destroyed. And so as soon as he is, trying to set up, thinking that his soldiers are going to hold this fort, and these are Roman soldiers, right? She's attacking him and she's taking over the fort. So he has to come again. And the Roman army has to come again and to try to take back the fort that Queen Amanirenas had took from him. And I want to keep the point. What is she fighting for, right? What is she fighting for? He doesn't completely state what she's fighting for, but it's clear that it's more than just gold. It's more than just land, because attacking the people in Elephantine, attacking the people in Aswan, the southern part of Kemet, she's making a statement. She's making some kind of statement, and she's picking this fight, right? She's picking it. So after he sets up the fort, and he goes away, and she comes and she attacks the fort again and takes it over, he has to come back and to fight her for control of the fort. So they're going back and forth. She's going back and forth with the Roman army. I believe she's fighting more than just for like gold or for money. I believe she's fighting more for her culture, something that means more to her than just something silly or something material. So as they're going back and forth in this fight, they come to a standstill, because, the Roman army is also at this time, Caesar's going on. They're also at this time fighting a lot of wars. It comes to a standstill. And eventually he's like, okay, well, what do you want? Like, why are you fighting me? What is your problem? Like, why are you attacking? And she basically tells them, or she sends messengers, this is being done through messengers, that the people there offended her, and that, she gives her reason. And he's like, well, these people are not in charge. The Roman generals tell the Queen Amanirenas' people and messengers that the people that are not in charge. Caesar is in charge of this area. This is Roman Empire. And they're like, who is Rome? Who is Caesar? Like, who cares about Caesar? We don't even know who is Caesar. And so, of course, the Roman general was like, surprised that they don't know or respect or care about Caesar. Like, they're like, we are in Nubia, in Meroitic, in Napatan. This is our area, and we don't really, who is Caesar? Like, we don't care about Caesar. Who is Caesar? So he tells them, look, I'm not really in control of this. You need to go talk to Caesar. If you're mad about what's happening in the southern part, you need to go to Caesar. And so apparently Queen Amanirenas sends her her entourage, if you will, her ambassadors to Caesar. So they meet apparently with Caesar, according to Strabo, and they have a meeting with him. And apparently, for whatever reason, which is very interesting, Caesar negotiates a treaty with them and basically gives them everything they asked for. That's what Strabo says. He actually, not only did they negotiate and whatever they were asking for, because he doesn't list what they were asking for, he says Caesar agreed to all their terms, and as well as agreed for them not to pay tribute. Like I'm not making it up, because like when does that ever happen, right? That they actually agreed that they not pay tribute anymore, that they didn't have to pay tribute to the Roman army. Now you start to think about it. Why would the Roman army allow another army, another people to not pay tribute? Why would they take them out of them not paying taxes and paying to them? So I don't know why. Whatever this was, when him saying that the Roman army kind of kicked their butt doesn't get with the facts that Caesar would give up tribute, or that they would be able to have everything they wanted in their negotiations and be able to at times kind of fight and have a buffer zone between them, because there ends up being a bit of a buffer zone in lower Anubia, and they go on. I mean, they go on for hundreds of years, still, developing their culture, living their culture, doing their things that they're doing, engaging in trade. They go on, and apparently, according to Strabo, they get everything they want in the agreement. In the peace agreement, that he gives them what he conceals, he's conciliatory and doesn't allow them to pay tribute and gives them whatever their terms were. And so when you start to think about it, as you start to kind of put this in place, you start to see, well, why this woman was fighting for something. A lot of times people will look at this, and a lot of times she is famous because she fought the Roman army and she faced the Roman army, and she lived to tell about it, right? She lived to tell about it. Her queendom stayed in place. The people of Kush began and continued to live for another 300 years more. For hundreds of years after her death, their culture was still alive. Like, imagine if she didn't fight. Imagine if the Roman army took over more of Nubia and came into Sudan, and what would the world be different? What stand would Kush have been able to make or not be able to make if she had not stood at that time and preserved her people? I believe she was fighting for a culture. And as you start to think about it, it starts to dig a little bit deeper that this woman saved her land. This woman saved her dignity. This woman, whatever the Roman army's intentions were, whether they were going to go farther south or not, right? She put up a line in what is today Northern Sudan. And even though she fought some, she lost some, she won some, and she basically won the treaty. She got what she needed and wanted out of the treaty, regardless of what you say. And even though the Roman army was, meant for a war machine, she negotiated and had her people negotiated their terms of the treaty and got what she wanted and preserved her land for hundreds of years. So I started to think about it. A lot of times people will look at it, and some people will tell her story as if it was a failure. People will tell her story as if, the Roman army killed a lot of people when they attacked parts of northern Sudan, that they set up that fortress there, and that a lot of people were killed. They tell that story, but what are you really fighting for? What is failure? A lot of times we look at failure in terms of what you're able to accomplish. We don't look at it like what you become. Her example, her lesson, what she meant to her people, preserving her people, fighting for people, is far more important what you become than what you own, right? And so at the end of the day, they were still successful, but I think it becomes a little deeper than that. So as I begin to sit back and talk about her, she becomes somebody I think is significant in history, because she's a woman saying, you're not going to take ours. We're not going to bend over. There's a significant thing that we fight. There's something that we believe in, and her culture is preserved. That whole area that is Meroitic, that whole area that is where you see examples of temples, and you can. This is not her. This is one of her counterparts, if you will. You see the symbols of powerful women and powerful men striking down their enemies. This is not a symbol that you see pretty much in ancient Kemet of women doing this. This is a woman, a queen of Kush, doing this. One of her counterparts, grabbing them, just as you see in like Abu Simbel and places like that. You don't see that very often. They are protecting their culture. This would last for hundreds of years after Amanirenas. Their whole culture and what they were putting forth would last for hundreds of years after that. So as I start to think about that, there's way more I want to dig into, because I think there's another important part in terms of what the people in Meroitic were practicing, what they believe. Even the Meroitic script, there's a script that we know they have, and a holy writing that they have that people have only been able to decipher 100 words of it. We don't know how to read the whole script. I'd love to be able to do that and to read it to you and to talk about it. We're going to kind of get into that. So as I talk about, I wanted to kind of pull up a couple things, because as we start to talk about this and just talk about her, just to kind of give a little quiz, I'm thinking about courses, and I'm thinking about how you put quizzes in. If you kind of had yourself a question, if you ask yourself the question, when did the Queen of Amanirenas live? Because the whole time period is so important. And we talked about it. And if you can remember right now, I ask you to think about it. If you can think about based on what we've said, because a lot of times when people talk about ancient Kush and they talk about Amanirenas and they talk about ancient Kemet, they get these time frames really mixed up. And we're talking hundreds of years and thousands of years of this time period. So when did she live? If you can look at this self, when did Queen Amanirenas live? Was it 40 AD, number 3? Was it 30 BC? Was it 300 BC? And if you're guessing, I should guess. If you guess number 2, you're right. If you remember number 2, you're right. It was 30 BC because that was right around the time when the Romans came and took over Kemet. 300 BC, you're talking about the Greek people taking over Kemet. 3000 BC, it's Kemet, right? 300 BC, that's the Greek taking over Kemet. 30 BC is when the Romans come into Kemet. And it is around that time, very shortly after the Romans take over Kemet, that they have a fight and engage with Queen Amanirenas in the battles that I just discussed, where she comes out of it alive and comes out of it negotiating a treaty where they still get exactly everything they want. So I just wanted to share that. I wanted to say God bless you. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to be putting a lot more out this. Please tell somebody about this and share this with them. Talk to you soon.